There are some quislings, like Bronislaw Kaminsky, whose lives are undoubtedly shitty. There are some quislings like Wang Jingwei, who did some good and a whole lot of bad. There are some quislings that would straight up have sold their mothers for their vision, like Anton Musert, and there are some quislings who would straight up have married their aunts to get ahead. Hello, also Anton Musert. But then there are some like Andrey Vlasov, who aren't outwardly as toxic, but nonetheless inwardly are full of the same cowardice, the same complexes, the same contradictions and the same contractions that almost tear them apart, and get a lot of other people torn apart in the process. This is the life of Andrey Vlasov. Andrey Andreevich Vlasov was not born the kind of person who, outwardly, would seem like a contradiction. He was born on September 14th, 1901, in the village of Lomokino, Nizhny Novgorod, and his life, in no way, shape or form, seemed to contradict anything stereotypically Russian. Life on the village was hard, there was work in the fields, his parents were peasants, there was religion, and the family grew up with 13 children. And yes, all of them had to work in the fields, because of so many mouths to feed. Andrey's father wanted his son to become a priest. However, he couldn't afford to pay all his children's education, so his elder brother Ivan subsequently paid for Andrey's education at the Nizhny Novgorod seminary, which, however, didn't last, because he soon dropped out. Although Vlasov would often use religious rhetoric throughout the later part of his life, there's no sign he ever affectively believed in it, even if he did cognitively. He did, however, have fine cognitive skills that took him into studying as an economist. This career as an economist, however, soon ended too, because Vlasov dropped out of that one as well, and instead joined the Red Army. His devotedly Christian family did not approve of this path. The Red Communists had just won much of the country and were fighting against the anti-communist Whites. The Reds stood for socialism, secularism and anti-church, and the Whites stood for nation, nationality and orthodoxy. Why, they reasoned, would Vlasov want to join such a cause, especially when the Reds were burning thousands of churches and slaughtering tens of thousands of priests? Vlasov, however, insisted on joining the Reds, interestingly for a supposedly dedicated Christian himself. He would later claim he did it to gain, quote, more farming areas and a better life for labourers, although one can do this without tens of thousands of burned churches and tens of thousands of shot priests. It may have been that Vlasov was, quote, Christian in the same way that someone who drinks, debauches and blasphemes occasionally goes to church, and it definitely showed an early opportunism. Regardless, he absolutely took the opportunity to show himself as a capable soldier. From 1919, at the height of the war, he began his career in the army. After completing a basic command course, he was sent to the Southern Front, with the 2nd Don Division. In spite of the fact that it was only a basic course, and he had little experience, the young officer distinguished himself on the battlefield, participating in the elimination of white forces, tied not just to Nestor Makhno, but also to Pyotr Wrangel and Anton Denikin. He was involved in often life-threatening, fierce hand-to-hand fighting, but the tall, strong Vlasov always came out on top, and was rewarded. In 1922, he completed the Vistral Army Training Course and studied as a non-commissioned officer at the Frunze Military Academy, the Soviet Union's most prestigious. Tellingly, he only joined the Communist Party in 1930, clearly having some qualms about its ideology, but these qualms didn't make him quibble nearly as much as he should have done as he advanced to the top, because by 1938, he was so trusted that he was sent to China as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. This was an incredibly trusted position, since this was in the middle of the Great Purge, when all kinds of officers with suspicious, quote, foreign connections were being killed, including Tukhachevsky, Oborovich, Yekir, and all kinds of officers who were veterans of the Spanish War, so those sent abroad, inevitably, especially when facing a rival empire, came under suspicion. Vlasov, however, due to his incredibly distinguished record, was sent there and did well in China, advising Chiang's army during the fight of the war on how best to deploy its infantry divisions, coordinate them with its tank formations, organise supplies and logistics. He did good, so good that from May he was made chief military advisor, and Chiang and the others always held him in high regard. Until his career in China suddenly came to a crashing end, and he was abruptly called home. In spite of being decorated with the Order of the Golden Dragon by Chiang, in spite of many Chinese seeing him as a hero, and in spite of playing a key role against the Japanese, command suddenly decided to recall him home, and nobody knows why exactly. Furthermore, when he got home, he received a less than friendly response. In fact, the beautiful watch that Chiang's wife had graciously gifted him in person was ripped from his wrist and confiscated. His order was confiscated too, and it seems possible he was in some disgrace. General Noam Sorokin, who knew him, claims he was recalled from China due to, quote, improper behaviour. It's never explained what this behaviour was, but we could infer from Vlasov's impulsive romantic instincts that it might have been something to do with women. Vlasov had a first wife, Anna, yet he also had a so-called frontline wife, Yulia, whom he had a child with. and another frontline wife, Agnesa, whom he also had a child with. He would also have a later wife, that he didn't tell the others about, and was known to be impulsive with his loins, so it's possible it could have been something to do with a woman, and given his later political opportunism, one wonders if it wasn't a warning sign. Regardless of what it was, however, Vlasov, as others have been, wasn't purged, or even sanctioned. He might have lost his Gliciny watch, but he didn't lose his Gliciny career. An attestation given to him in 1939, signed by Brigade Commander Ilyin, reads that he was a, quote, highly competent officer, with good general education and military training, who demonstrated expertise and enjoyed considerable respect, but did, however, note that, due to nerves, he sometimes became, quote, rude. It's not exactly detailed what this rudeness was, but there were no more rude awakenings. In December 1939, he was made commander of the 99th Infantry Division in western Ukraine, and Stalin also made him a brigadier general. Some might argue that Vlasov was only appointed this far because so many officers had been slaughtered, tens of thousands, including 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, that they had to appoint somebody, but Vlasov actually had more than proven himself. We still don't know the exact reason for being recalled from China, but whether it was a demotion or whether it was to put him onto higher prospects, he atoned for it. When he commanded the 11th Infantry Division of the 4th Turkestan Division, it went from a, quote, ragtag to the best in the Kiev military region, and Minister of Defense Semyon Timoshenko himself proclaimed the 99th Division to be the best trained in all the Soviet Union. Vlasov was featured on the Red Army magazine, given a gold watch, not as good as Chinese gold, but still damn good, as well as the Order of the Red Banner, then was made a Major General. Interestingly, for those who claimed Vlasov was always a secret dissident playing the long game, he remembered, I had no hesitation whatsoever. I always stood firmly on the general line of the party, and always fought for it. Although later, very interestingly enough, he would state he acquired anti-Soviet thoughts in 1937. But one thing he acquired first was command of the 4th Mechanized Corps, a well-equipped formation on the Ukrainian-Polish border, just in time for the German invasion of the Soviet Union. At 6 a.m. on June 22nd of 1941, German forces smashed their way through the Soviet borders and raced toward Moscow, taking over 3 million Soviet soldiers prisoner, killing hundreds of thousands, and taking vast territories. It was ironic, only 2 years ago, the Nazis and Soviets had divided Poland between them and invaded it together. What was also ironic, however, was how amazingly well Vlasov could even turn defeat into a victory. Khrushchev personally commended him and had him serve in defense of Kiev. In spite of 665,000 soldiers being encircled there, however, Vlasov and his men fought their way out. And not just that, fighting so hard, with Vlasov often fighting personally, that every time the Germans suffered heavy losses. Konstantin Arafeyev, a hero of the Soviet Union, who fought alongside Vlasov, noted that not only did he and his group not surrender, but sent an insulting note to the Germans. And one person who was not at all insulted, in spite of the fact that they'd retreated, was Stalin. Joseph shot soldiers who failed him. Stalin called Vlasov to meet him in the Kremlin, as the Germans advanced on the city, and asked him, very frankly, about the chances of holding it. Vlasov said so decisively it could be done that the outcome of the meeting was him being assigned command of the 20th Army, in defence of the entirety of Moscow. Stalin pulled out all the stops for Vlasov. He was given a chance after defeat, given command of the 20th Army, and the enemy were thrown back by January, and so Vlasov was given even greater favouritism. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner and promoted to Lieutenant General. He was presented to the Western media to interview, his photo appeared beside the other, quote, military saviours of Moscow, and he even appeared in the American version of the documentary, The Defeat of German Troops Near Moscow, which won an Oscar. Zhukov assessed Vlasov very favourably, and a book was even written about him, entitled Stalin's Commander. Also a sign of how trusted he was that he was allowed to speak freely with Western correspondents in the hyper-controlled, hyper-totalitarian Soviet Union, and his star just seemed to shoot further and further. But just as quickly shot to earth and burned, because Stalin then stupidly, ridiculously, audaciously wasted Vlasov on an offensive that had no chance of succeeding, the second counterattack outside Moscow. Stalin created the Volkhov Front, named for a region outside Moscow, in December 1941. The front consisted of 2 armies, the 4th and 52nd, then the 2nd and 59th. The objective was to help break the German siege of Leningrad, and, full of Stalin-forced optimism, they went on the offensive, on January 13th, 1942. But the Germans knew the offensive was coming. Furthermore, they also had immense air superiority, And even furthermore, the newly formed 2nd and 59th Armies had badly trained troops, who were unaccustomed to fighting in forests and marshes, lacked heavy artillery and ammunition, didn't have a unified command, suffered from malaria and diseases, and what you'd expect happened. Vlasov was suddenly given command of the 2nd Shock Army after its commander got sick, and of course, as it slogged forward, the spring thaw turned the frost into swamps, and Vlasov and his army became stuck in the forest. Then its flanks got exposed. Then on March 18th, a German pincer attack severed Vlasov's lines of communication, leaving him trapped. Not, however, for long. Red Army reinforcements broke through the encirclement, and the day seemed saved. And then on April 23rd, the day was lost again, because Stalin suddenly, without warning, dissolved the Volkhov Front to form another group, subordinate to the Leningrad Front, leaving Vlasov and the 2nd Shock Army suddenly abandoned, all alone, in the 50-mile-long pocket, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of hostile territory. He waited all the way until June to relieve it, and by then it was too late. It was also too late to save Vlasov's patriotism. During that time, Vlasov claims, he had something of an epiphany. Maybe, ironically, because epiphanies and belief in anything beyond Stalin were illegal in the Soviet Union. He wrote, "Is not Bolshevism the chief enemy of the Russian people? There, in the forests and moors, I finally concluded that it is my duty to call the Russian nation to struggle for the overthrow of Bolshevik power, the creation of a new Russia, where every man could be happy." However, it may have been because he was thinking of the unhappy fate of General Samsonov, a loyalist general who had recently been encircled, and, in the name of Stalin, had committed suicide. Vlasov was in a weird position. He refused to be flown out on the last plane, but also he wouldn't abandon his troops. But at the same time, he wouldn't fight to the death. What did he do? Did he kill himself in Stalin's name? After the purges, the killings of his friends, the jail or medal, Vlasov knew the answer to that. He would not commit suicide in the name of Stalin. So he chose another method, just wander around with a small group of men through random villages. Yeah, that would work. On July 11th, Vlasov and a cook named Verona went in search of food in the village of Tukoveshi, home to old believers who were opposed to the state. And the house they turned out to be the house of an anti-government elder. While Vlasov and Verona were eating, said elder called the local Quisling police, who surrounded the house and arrested the men, with Vlasov insisting, strangely specifically, that he was just a, quote, refugee teacher. The police locked them in a barn, and on July 12th, Captain Max Schwertner, the chief of intelligence for the German 38th Army, arrested them. Vlasov was not happy, obviously, but neither was he devastated. He was sent to the Venezia military camp for high-ranking officers, where he met Captain Wilfried Strickfeld, a Baltic German who was attempting to create a Russian liberation movement. Strickfeld, who had been a participant in the White Armies, played on Vlasov's ego, his sense of historical destiny, and frustration with Stalin, pushing him to become involved in aiding the German forces. Soon, he was successful, and Vlasov, in August, wrote a letter to the Germans, explaining how the USSR could be defeated, if nationalistic Russian patriotism was emphasised, if it was emphasised how strong Stalin still was, and that it was crucial that the Russian people, if treated well, would work with the Germans to defeat the communists. Millions of Russians and other nationalities loathed Stalin, loathed the USSR, loathed the atheistic system, and would be willing to see the Germans as liberators if they behaved well. How did we miss him? Legend has Stalin mourning once he learned Vlasov had turned traitor in one of the least self-aware moments of the century. Fortunately for Stalin, however, the Germans were also lacking in self-awareness. Although Vlasov was taken to Berlin, under the control of the Wehrmacht propaganda department, and allowed to draft plans for the creation of a Russian liberation army, not once did Hitler entertain it. Hitler didn't work with the Russians. In fact, he did the opposite. Although a number of German military officers worked with Vlasov, liked him, lobbied for him, and wanted for him to build an anti-Stalin army, Hitler and his loyalists pointedly and proudly refused to even entertain such an idea, with Himmler even calling the Vlasovs, quote, pigs. Not trusting these hated Slavs, they refused Vlasov's idea of recruiting hundreds of thousands of willing anti-communist partisans, prisoners and supporters, many of whom had Red Army training, and many of whom had relatives slaughtered by Stalin. They wouldn't give rights to Russians, they wouldn't liberate them from collective farms, and they certainly wouldn't stop provoking the peasants. Army Group Centre even shot 10,592, quote, partisans for the deaths of 2 soldiers. And as you'd expect, this had the effect you'd imagine it did, the opposite one. Even though some Russians did collaborate, many others, who might have dallied with the delusion that the Germans were allies, began to fight them even harder. Sabotage started. Defiance did too. A huge Stalin-inspired partisan movement blew up. Posters were put up. Then charges, then IEDs, and soon the Germans were fighting Stalin and the Soviet people, All the while Vlasov and his people sat there in a prison camp, living in a comfortable captivity, rotting, when they could have been working. He and his leading officers could read books, meet people, socialise, write, but do nothing else. Nothing but make propaganda. Lots and lots of propaganda. As 1942 wore on, however, the Battle of Stalingrad began to bite, and so did the weight of the war, so Vlasov began to be used more and more. The first effort was on September 10th, 1942, in the form of an anti-Stalin leaflet, signed by Vlasov and sent to, or dropped to, Red Army soldiers, outlining why Vlasov had taken up arms against Bolshevism. It persuaded Russian soldiers to surrender and join the so-called Liberation Army. Many did, only to then be jailed in terrible concentration camps and starved to death, making many more unwilling to do so, and making Vlasov lose even more popularity. He was then permitted to make several trips around the occupied territories, including to Pskov. And in Pskov, a scandal broke out. Vlasov referred to the Germans as, quote, guests, implying their stay was temporary. Hitler found out and was enraged, Vlasov was put under house arrest, and even threatened with being handed over to the Gestapo. Deeply depressed and feeling used, he threatened to resign, but was dissuaded at the last minute by his confidence. He once again offered his service to the Germans, but they were simply unwilling to work with him, and Ministry of Propaganda official Eberhard Tolbert called Vlasov, quote, National Socialist, and complained, "It is significant that he does not fight Jewry, that the Jewish question is not recognised at all," and criticised him for his, quote, watered-down infusion of liberal and Bolshevik ideologies, strong Anglophile sympathies, and toying with the possible idea of a change of course. Vlasov could see very well where this was going. He could see that he was being used, he could see he was being exploited, he could see the Germans committing mass atrocities, but, fatally, refused to change his own course, and even began, appallingly cynically, lecturing prisoners of war that they may as well join him, because the Soviet government had declared them all traitors, and Stalin would send them to Siberia. As a reward for this, in January 1943, the Germans allowed him to officially form the Russian Liberation Army. 2 years after Germany had been driven back from Moscow. Several months before Germans would be slaughtered at Stalingrad. A year before the Germans would scurry from Smolensk, and it wasn't even intended to be a, quote, army at all. It was a moving modern-day Potemkin village. This army consisted of a training camp set within army barracks in Dabendorf, so not even a proper base. Hitler still insisted Vlasov be used as a propaganda weapon, nothing more, and Vlasov soon, once again, became frustrated at the way he was being treated. But not, crucially, enough for him to turn back. His propaganda encouraged hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers to surrender, many of whom deeply believed they'd be fighting for his army, and most ended up in power camps, shot in power camps, starving to death in, yes you guessed it, more power camps, or assigned to guard German rear units, and not allowed on the front lines. Maybe, just as he hadn't cared for the millions of priests, he didn't care about his soldiers either. With the Germans finally losing the war, in late 1944, months after D-Day, they decided it might be a good time to use Vlasov, and finally, he was allowed to form his army. He even had a cordial meeting with Himmler, assured him the war could be won, which both knew was a lie, then cemented this Himmler-aligned opportunism by marrying a Himmler-aligned German woman, despite neither speaking the other's language. As well as tying the knot to her, he tied the knot of his newfound alliance with Himmler, with the much too late step of activating his army, following the Prague Manifesto of November 1944, announcing the establishment of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, which would overthrow communism and start a, quote, glorious new Russia. It was signed by Vlasov and 36 high-ranking defector allies. In the ironically German-occupied, German-slaughtered Czech city of Prague, and no high-ranking German officials attended whatsoever, and what was already a no-hope situation suddenly became even no-hopier. Vlasov was promised 10 divisions by Himmler, and only got 2. Only current powers could join. Russians already serving in German uniforms were barred, and the division was to be used only to defend Germany. And defend Germany it amazingly did. On April 14th, given the task of retaking a Soviet bridgehead, it actually did a good job, even if the objective failed, taking some casualties but causing more. Then General Bunyachenko, one of its leading officers, who had finally had enough, marched on Prague to liberate the city with the help of the Czech resistance, turning on the Germans after turning on the Soviets. Vlasov soon joined it, aiming to unite the whole army. And he, to his credit, wasn't going to run. Various RLA officers tried to persuade him to. A plane was even willing to take him, but Vlasov refused. A leader who abandons his people at the critical moment cannot be of any use any longer, he mused, and would soon have a lot more time to think over this musing. On May 8th, Germany capitulated, and the Americans were in Plzeň, 56 miles south of Prague. The Red Army was approaching, and obviously, Vlasov and his gang weren't too keen to go see Stalin. He drove ahead and surrendered to an American outpost. After a short interview, he was housed in Lanare Castle. Captain Donahue, the American commander of the town, was interested in Vlasov's motives in taking up arms against Stalin. Vlasov explained everything passionately and sincerely, and Donahue was so impressed he actually shook Vlasov's hand and promised not to let him and the ROA be extradited to the Soviet Union. General Bunyachenko, who had led the Oder battle and the battle in Prague, soon joined Vlasov, and then he and Vlasov were told the Americans weren't going to intern them. The official story is that next, on May 12th, the Americans got into a jeep that was going to take Vlasov and Bunyachenko to the quote, American headquarters, wink wink, that halfway the column was stopped by the Soviets, and that was that. It later emerged, of course, that the quote, freedom-loving United States had driven Vlasov right up to the Red Army and handed him over, as well as all his men. Thousands were herded and harassed like sheep into cattle wagons, handed back over like animals, beaten and bludgeoned by Allied troops. Some were even shot and killed, but that would have been a kind fate for Vlasov. Stalin's shining star soon became Stalin's seething example. He and the others were put on trial for treason, then hanged, and an eyewitness said the executions were so gruesome he couldn't put them in words. What do I think of Andrey Vlasov? Here's what I think. There have been many attempts to paint Vlasov as a hero or liberator. The quote, committed Christian who joined the Red Army. The quote, devoted family man who cheated on his 4 simultaneous wives. The quote, liberator who lured hundreds of thousands of men into imprisonment with Hitler. The quote, hero who worked with Himmler in forcing starving prisoners to pick up guns. And the quote, hero who flew the swastika. I think Vlasov cognitively believed in freedom, justice and other concepts, but affectively, it didn't bother him too much. But he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, people say. He was playing the long game. It was Stalin or Hitler. Not necessarily. It's true that Vlasov didn't fully know what the Germans would do in June 1941. But within weeks, when he was still on the Soviet side, the Germans were already shooting soldiers, killing captives, genociding Jews and crushing cultural heritage sites. He knew by then. He was at the front with the suffering civilians. He fought the Germans in person, again and again. He saw their antics. He saw their behaviour. He knew what they were about. He could have disassociated. He could have resigned. He could have gone back to the POW camp, by his own admission. And yes, he would have endured some hardships, but would death have been worse than this? But Ben, you say, surely it was okay for him to play the long game and work with the Germans in the hope that he could change the system from within. I've never understood this long game and system from within thing. Politicians use this as an excuse to play their politics all the time. I'm joining X corrupt regime to fight it from within. I'm part of X unjust system to change it from the inside. I'm going to use X filthy system to get into power, then establish justice. The truth is, you will never establish justice doing such a thing, because you are deeply immersed in everything that contradicts it. It reminds me of Trump supporters saying the establishment is full of paedophiles. But it's okay for Trump to get elected by the paedophiles, pass bills with the paedophiles, party with the paedophiles and shake hands with the paedophiles. Because that's okay, it's the long game. The long game, to me, is an excuse to be a stupid, deluded power grabber, or at least someone too foolish to turn back. Vlasov played the long game, and that's how he ended up. In a Prague occupied by the Gestapo, on a podium presided over by a swastika, swearing over a symbol of slaughter to build a big, beautiful Russia. It never works.